Are you serious? I asked Nadia, barely believing my own voice. Yes, sorry, she replied, looking at me with that sad, distant expression. You just had the misfortune of marrying a woman who's been battered by life. She shrugged, but her words hit me like a punch. Her voice was flat, almost rehearsed, like she'd been waiting for this moment. And that's when she told me she was going to Chicago to see her ex-husband. For a second, I just stood there, not knowing what to say. Chicago? Ex-husband? None of it made any sense. Nadia and I had been married for nearly a decade, and in all those years, she'd never once hinted at going back to him. To me, he was nothing more than a shadow from her past, the guy she'd occasionally mention, but never in any depth. She always said it was over between them, that their relationship had been a toxic mess she'd barely survived. Now, here she was telling me she was going to see him like it was some ordinary trip. I took a deep breath, fighting the urge to snap. When were you planning on telling me this, Nadia? I asked, trying to keep my tone calm, though I could feel the anger bubbling underneath. She sighed, rubbing her temples. I don't know soon, I guess. I didn't mean to hurt you. Didn't mean to hurt me? The words were laughable. I'd been through a lot with Nadia, and I'd always been there for her, even when things were rough. Now, she was telling me she was leaving to visit the man who had, by her own account, broken her spirit. I met Nadia in one of those strange turns of life that only make sense looking back. At the time, I was on a long tour through Europe, playing gigs in places that sounded romantic on paper but felt pretty grim in reality. Night after night, I was exhausted, missing home, and drinking way too much. Being on the road was intense. Constant hotel rooms, crowded buses, and fleeting crowds that cheered and disappeared. To be honest, Nadia didn't catch my eye right away. There was someone else who did. Mia, one of the band's sound engineers, was witty, smart, and had this way of laughing that filled a room. She was a breath of fresh air in a long, exhausting tour. We hit it off instantly, and for the first time in years, I felt that spark, the one that makes you feel like a teenager again. We spent hours talking, and I thought maybe, just maybe, something would happen between us. But that hope faded fast. Mia started dating my best friend, another musician from our band. It hit me harder than I'd expected, and seeing them together every day felt like rubbing salt in the wound. That's when Nadia came into the picture. She was a friend of one of our European tour managers, someone who would occasionally come out to our gigs. Quiet, almost unnoticeable, Nadia was the type who lingered in the background, watching everything, taking it all in with a quiet curiosity. She wasn't the loud or vibrant type that usually caught my attention, but one night, after another gig, we found ourselves sitting alone in the back of a bar. We started talking mostly about little things, the tour, the band, life in the cities we were passing through. There was something calming about her presence, something that felt like a pause in the chaos. She listened without judgment, without trying to give me advice or fix things. And somehow, in that moment, I found myself opening up to her about Mia, about the bitter disappointment that had settled in my chest. We talked until the bar closed, and I walked her back to her place under the dim streetlights, our voices echoing through the empty streets. Looking back, I think that night was the first time I really felt seen by someone in a long time. Back then, Nadia had a boyfriend named Tom. He was a wrestler, built like a wall, from what I could tell, and totally dedicated to his sport. They'd been together for 4 years, which I only learned after that first night we'd spent talking. She was upfront about it, casually mentioning Tom in passing, as if he was just some friend back home rather than a long-term boyfriend. I remember thinking, of course she has a boyfriend, but it didn't sting as much as I thought it would. At that point, she was still just someone I talked to on the tour, someone who knew how to listen and somehow make the noise around me feel less chaotic. But then I saw her Facebook photo, and something shifted. There she was holding this huge bouquet of flowers, her smile big and genuine. The caption read, "Thanks for making me smile for a whole 4 years." I'll admit, I lingered on that photo longer than I should have. It was the kind of photo that showed how well Tom knew her, how he knew the exact kind of flowers she'd like. I even found myself wondering if she was just settling for a long-distance relationship out of habit, or if she was actually crazy about the guy. There were no signs she was unhappy. If anything, she seemed perfectly content whenever she mentioned him. Just a quick, easy reference now and then, as if it was a fact of her life that would never change. Still, Tom was back home, training, living his own life, while Nadia was out here with us, part of our little tour bubble. And despite the flowers, the photos, and all the love she showed him online, She was spending most of her nights hanging out with us. More and more, she'd stick around after gigs, joining the crew, sharing drinks and stories. And whenever things quieted down, we'd end up talking, almost like it was becoming our thing. Our conversations grew longer, our time together more frequent. It wasn't like I'd planned it. I was still trying to move past the disappointment with Mia, but Nadia was always around. After gigs, when everyone else was off doing their own thing, we'd find ourselves tucked away at a quiet table, trading stories, laughter, and inside jokes that started forming naturally between us. There were little things that made her feel different from anyone else on tour. The way her eyes lit up when I told her some ridiculous story from my past, or how her laugh seemed to cut right through the noise of any crowded room we were in. It didn't take long for things to get closer. She'd lean in when she spoke, and I'd catch the subtle touches, a hand on my shoulder, a soft nudge when she laughed, her fingertips resting on my arm just a little longer than necessary. One night, as we were walking back to the hotel, she looped her arm through mine without a second thought, like it was the most natural thing in the world. I didn't pull away. There were other signs, too, subtle but unmistakable. She'd seek me out in a crowd, her eyes finding mine across the room, and every time, there was that small, knowing smile that seemed meant just for me. If someone cracked a joke at my expense, she'd roll her eyes and side with me. Or if I was just having a rough day, she'd find a way to lift my spirits, some quiet encouragement or a warm smile, things that went deeper than words. It was as if, in her own quiet way, she was letting me know she cared. And somehow, that connection, the little signs she was giving, the closeness that was growing between us started to feel more real than anything else in my life at that time. One night it happened. We were in a tiny hotel room after a long day, and the rest of the crew was off doing their own thing. It wasn't planned. Nothing about Nadia and I had been. But somehow, we ended up back in her room. It started as it usually did, talking about everything and nothing, laughing about the day's mishaps on tour, our hands brushing now and then as we lay next to each other. The room was dimly lit, the low hum of the city filtering through the cracked window. She was lying close to me, her face inches from mine, her eyes tracing my face with that warm, knowing look she'd been giving me more and more lately. I could feel the space between us shrinking, could feel her breath mixing with mine as the words trailed off. And we just lay there, silent, close, her fingers lightly tracing circles on my arm, sending a warmth through me that I hadn't felt in ages. I don't know if I made the first move or if she did, but somewhere in that charged silence, I leaned in and our lips met. At first, it was gentle, hesitant, but when she responded, pulling me closer, that caution vanished. It was like a spark igniting a blaze. Every emotion we'd been holding back came rushing to the surface. Each kiss deeper, more urgent, as if we were trying to make up for all the time we'd spent skirting around this moment. Her hand slid up my neck, pulling me closer, her fingers tangling in my hair as if she never wanted to let go. It was unlike any kiss I'd ever experienced. Intense, consuming, like the rest of the world had faded away, leaving only us. Every nerve felt electrified, every touch setting off a fresh wave of heat. We were both caught up in it, the energy between us unstoppable, undeniable. The last month of the tour was like living in a dream, each day blurred into the next, every night spent a little closer, the moments between Nadia and me growing more intense, more electric. We'd be with the band during the day, playing our parts, but the nights were ours. And every night, after everyone else drifted off, she'd find her way to me. Sometimes we'd talk for hours just lying there, her head on my shoulder, her hand in mine. But as close as we were, there was always this reminder, this sting. She'd step away to take her nightly phone call with Tom, her voice dropping to that soft tone I'd grown to envy. She would come back, curl up beside me, and I wouldn't say a word about it. I'd push away the thought of Tom, of everything waiting for us outside the walls of that room. And the closer we got to the end of the tour, the harder it became to ignore. One night, she looked at me, her face barely visible in the dim light, and whispered, "What will I do without you when we go back?" I knew she felt it too. The pull between us, the inevitability of the end. We both knew our hometown, Indianapolis, was waiting with all the complications that came with it. Then, on our last night before we all went our separate ways, it happened. We'd been out celebrating, the band throwing one last party in some random bar, but I'd been restless, anxious, knowing the tour was ending, and so was this chapter with Nadia. When she slipped her hand in mine and gave me that look, I didn't hesitate. We left the bar, her hand never leaving mine, and somehow found ourselves back in her room, the reality of the morning's goodbyes hovering over us. We didn't talk much. There was nothing left to say, not really. She looked at me, her eyes filled with something I couldn't name, and pulled me to her. That night, everything between us broke free. It was like all the weeks of tension, of feelings we'd held back, came pouring out. Being with her felt like nothing else in the world mattered. Nothing but that moment, that night, her in my arms. We both knew it would change things, make leaving that much harder, but in that moment it didn't matter. We fell asleep tangled up together, a mix of warmth, comfort, and that bittersweet sense of knowing it was our last night like this. Coming off the plane in Indianapolis felt surreal. I'd spent the last month wrapped up in this bubble with Nadia, and as soon as I saw Tom standing there at the gate, the whole thing hit me like a bucket of cold water. He was holding a bouquet of roses, his face lighting up as soon as he spotted Nadia. She looked at him, smiled, and walked right into his arms, her hands still brushing mine as she let go. I was standing just a few feet away, feeling like I'd stepped into a scene I didn't belong in. She told me about him so many times, but seeing him there in the flesh, looking like the picture-perfect boyfriend with those flowers and that wide, happy grin, made my stomach turn. He was oblivious, completely unaware of everything that had happened between Nadia and me on tour. Every glance, every whisper, every night we'd spent together. He didn't know, and yet he was the one she'd come back to, the one she was going home with. Tom came up to me, holding out his hand, giving me this warm, friendly shake that threw me off. "Hey man," he said with a smile. "I've heard a lot about you guys. Thanks for keeping an eye on her." His tone was easy, casual, like we were old friends instead of whatever we were. I tried to return the handshake, forced a smile, but inside I was churning, nervous that he might catch on, might see something in the way I looked at her or in the stiffness of my voice. But Tom didn't suspect a thing. To him, I was just one of her bandmates. As I watched him hold her close, I felt the weight of what had happened settle on my shoulders. It felt like our whole last month had been this secret life, a story with an expiration date that had now come to an end. Nadia glanced at me over his shoulder, just for a moment, a look in her eyes that was gone as quickly as it came. With that, they turned and walked out, her arm looped through his. I stood there, watching them disappear into the crowded airport, my heart caught between what had been and the sudden emptiness it left behind. After Nadia went back to Chicago with Tom, life in Indianapolis settled into something dull and gray. Days slipped by, the routine of rehearsals, gigs, and my usual haunts feeling emptier than ever. I'd catch myself staring at my phone, hoping to see her name light up on the screen, even when I knew it was a long shot. But every now and then, she'd surprise me with a call, her voice slipping through the line like a spark in the dullness. She'd ask how things were going with the band, tell me she missed Indy, missed all of us, missed me. We never said it out loud, but I could feel it in her voice. There was a tension, a lingering pull we were both trying to ignore but couldn't shake. Every few weeks, she'd make an excuse to come down to Indianapolis. She'd claim it was just to catch up with old friends, hang out with the band, and relive the tour days for a bit. But I knew it was more than that. I could tell by the way her gaze would linger just a second too long, or by how she'd find her way beside me at every get-together, her hand brushing mine when no one was looking. It didn't take long for that old fire between us to reignite, and this time, it felt hotter, bolder. We'd sneak glances, exchange those fleeting touches that said more than we'd ever dare to admit. She'd laugh at some joke, leaning close, her fingers tracing my arm absent-mindedly, like it was the most natural thing in the world. And whenever we'd find a quiet moment alone, the air around us seemed to thicken, every second loaded with that unsaid desire that had never really gone away. One evening, after a late band rehearsal, she lingered longer than usual. Everyone else had headed out, leaving the two of us alone in the empty studio. I could feel the tension, thick and electric, as we stood there, neither of us making a move to leave. She gave me that look, the one I'd been thinking about every day since the tour ended. And just like that, all the space we'd tried to put between us vanished. We both knew the risks, knew the reality of her life back in Chicago. But in that moment, it didn't matter. When Nadia started coming back to Indianapolis, it was like picking up right where we'd left off. One night would turn into a couple of days, each visit longer than the last. We didn't talk about Tom. We both knew he was still in the picture, just another fact we pushed aside. She'd show up, and it was as if everything else melted away. We'd go out together, just the two of us, acting like any other couple. Late dinners, quiet bars, places we knew we wouldn't run into anyone we knew. It was reckless, sure, but there was something intoxicating about having her by my side again, like we were in our own little world where nothing else mattered. Then, inevitably, one of us would say something, or we'd catch a look from a stranger that reminded us of reality, of the fact that this thing between us was as fragile as it was intense. After each visit, she'd go back to Chicago, back to Tom, and I'd be left in Indianapolis, wondering how I'd let it get this far. It was a strange, almost surreal feeling, knowing I was the one she was sneaking away to see, that I was the one she called when she needed to escape. It felt wrong, sure, but it felt good too, and that's what made it so hard to stop. I tell myself, this has to be the last time, but the moment she'd call or text, saying she was coming back to Indy for a few days, all that resolve would disappear. I'd be there waiting, acting like none of it was complicated, that there weren't three people tangled up in this mess we'd made. And every time, I'd catch myself wondering, how did I end up here? How do we let it get to this point? Maybe it was the loneliness, the fact that she made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. Or maybe it was that quiet desperation in her eyes, that longing she hid from everyone else. Whatever it was, it felt real in a way that nothing else did. And I kept telling myself that was enough. But deep down, I knew we were playing with fire, knew that eventually this would come crashing down around us. I'd known all along that this thing with Nadia couldn't stay hidden forever. Every time she slipped away from Chicago to be with me, a part of me was bracing for the day Tom would find out. But I kept ignoring it, pushing that thought to the back of my mind, pretending we'd get away with it somehow. Then one day, it all caught up with me. I got the call late in the afternoon, one of the guys from the band with a shaky voice on the other end. "Hey man, just a heads up, but Tom's been asking around. He's trying to find you." The moment I heard his words, my stomach dropped. I knew exactly what that meant. There was no other reason for Tom to come looking for me. Not after all this time. Nadia's secrets, our secrets, had finally caught up with us. I spent the rest of the day waiting, every ring of my phone making my heart race, every sound from outside my apartment setting me on edge. By the time evening rolled around, I was all nerves, barely holding it together. That's when Tom finally called. I picked up, my voice steady despite the dread gnawing at me. "Hey," he started, his tone forced, like he was playing at being casual. "Listen, I got this idea. I want to surprise Nadia with a music track. Something special, you know? And I could use your help with it." I could tell from the start that this wasn't about a song. He was holding back, his voice tight, barely concealing the bitterness underneath. And I knew this wasn't about music, wasn't about a gift for Nadia. This was about the truth. Tom wasn't calling for my help. He was calling because he wanted answers, and he wanted them from me. When I agreed to meet Tom, I knew it wouldn't be pretty. He suggested a spot at the edge of town, some dingy bar with dim lighting and walls that seemed to absorb every whispered threat. I'd thought about backing out, about giving him some excuse, but something about the way he'd asked, cold, almost mechanical, told me he wouldn't take no for an answer. He was waiting when I walked in, sitting alone in a booth near the back, his eyes dark and unreadable. He didn't waste any time on pleasantries. As soon as I sat down, he went straight to the point. "What's going on between you and Nadia?" he asked, his voice low, each word carefully measured. There was no small talk, no pretense, just a straightforward question that hung heavy in the air. I tried to keep my composure, stalling with a drink, but I could feel the intensity in his stare, like he was seeing right through me. "Nothing," I managed to say, though I knew he wouldn't bite. He didn't even flinch, just leaned in closer, his voice dropping to an almost dangerous whisper. "Listen, man, I don't have time for games. If you don't tell me what I want to know, I'll break your hands." And I'm not kidding. His voice was calm, unsettlingly calm, like he'd already decided what he was going to do. Tom wasn't bluffing. I could see that in his eyes. He wasn't just some angry boyfriend. He was someone who knew how to follow through on a threat. I felt my hands clench under the table, the reality of it sinking in, the thought of lying again, of feeding him some weak excuse flickered through my mind, but I knew it wouldn't work. So I told him. I told him everything. The late nights, the sneaking around, the months Nadia and I had spent together behind his back. I didn't hold back, didn't try to sugarcoat it or downplay what had happened. I told him the truth, raw and ugly. Every detail pouring out as if confessing would somehow lessen the weight of it. When I finished, Tom didn't say anything right away. He just stared at me, his jaw tight, his fists clenched on the table. I braced myself, fully expecting him to lash out, to make good on his threat. But he didn't. He just sat there, silent, letting the truth settle between us like a stone. A few months before all of this unraveled, Tom had proposed to Nadia. She'd even told me about it, her eyes lighting up with excitement mixed with a touch of hesitation that, at the time, I'd chosen to ignore. She'd said yes to him, promising a future together, a life they'd both talked about building someday. She never wore the ring when she came to see me, though, and whenever I asked about it, she'd brush it off, change the subject, or give some vague excuse. Now, after everything came crashing down, she was calling me in tears, her voice barely recognizable through the sobs. She was hurt, betrayed, confused, and the weight of it hit me harder than I'd expected. "Why did you do this?" she asked, her voice breaking. I thought we had something real, and now everything's gone." I sat there, the phone pressed to my ear, her words stabbing into me like shards of glass. I wanted to explain, to tell her how I felt, how I'd never meant for it to go this far. But what could I say? It was true. I'd let it happen, kept letting it happen, ignoring every reason to stop. And now, she was left picking up the pieces of her life, her engagement shattered, her trust broken. "Nadia," the words stuck in my throat. Apologies, explanations. None of it would change what had happened. I didn't mean for it to end like this. But it did, she said, her voice small, defeated. "I lost everything, and now I don't even know who I am. All because I thought you and I." She trailed off, her sobs filling the silence that followed. I wanted to comfort her, to somehow take away the pain I'd caused, but I knew I couldn't. I'd led her down this path, one small choice at a time, until we'd crossed a line we couldn't go back from. And now, we were both standing on opposite sides of a broken promise, with nothing left to say. After months of silence, just when I'd begun to think she'd cut me out for good, Nadia reached out. It was a simple message, something casual and safe, but even seeing her name on my screen brought back everything we'd tried to leave behind. I hesitated before responding, knowing the risks, the baggage, the scars we'd both been left with, but I couldn't help myself. I replied. One message turned into another, then a phone call, then late-night conversations that went on for hours, as if those months apart had been a mere pause in our story. She spoke of the hurt, of how hard it had been to pick up the pieces after the breakup with Tom. But beneath the pain, there was that familiar spark, the pull that had always been there, waiting to reignite. And I could feel it too. No matter how wrong it was, no matter how much damage had been done, something between us was unfinished, unbreakable. Before long, she started visiting Indianapolis again. This time, things felt different. Not like stolen moments or hidden secrets, but like a chapter we were both stepping into with our eyes open. Each time she was here, it was like we were the only two people in the world, wrapped up in that strange mix of love and fire that only we could create together. Nights filled with laughter, days spent exploring the city like it was new, every moment charged with that passion we couldn't seem to shake. There was no hiding now, no pretending. We were both free to be with each other, and the intensity was as intoxicating as ever. We knew we'd been through the worst, but somehow, the history only made our connection feel stronger, deeper. It was like trying to hold on to a flame that could scorch, but neither of us was willing to let go. I should have seen it coming. After everything we'd gone through, after how things had started between us, the thought should have been there, nagging at me. If she'd cheated on Tom, what was to stop her from doing the same to me someday? But I was blind to it, too caught up in the whirlwind of being with her, of having that fire we shared to think logically. I ignored the warning signs, told myself that what we had was different, that somehow we were the exception. And so, we got married. In those early days, we were happy, genuinely happy. It was like we were in our own world, a world built on shared memories and laughter, on the kind of connection that doesn't fade. I was all in, thinking I'd finally found what I'd been searching for. We had our routines, our inside jokes, our quiet moments that felt so much deeper than anything I'd known before. But slowly, those bells started ringing, little reminders of the cracks in the foundation we'd ignored. There were the missed calls, the texts left unanswered, the way her mood would sometimes swing so sharply it left me wondering what I'd done wrong. She'd be sweet, attentive, like nothing could come between us one moment, and distant, almost guarded, the next. If I asked her about it, she'd brush it off, say she was just tired or stressed, giving me a small smile that was meant to reassure but left me feeling uneasy. Sometimes, I'd catch her staring at her phone with this look, one I couldn't quite place. And whenever she caught me looking, she'd quickly put it down, her smile bright but strained, like she was hiding something just beneath the surface. I'd tell myself I was just being paranoid, that we'd been through too much for her to ever do what she'd done to Tom. But deep down, I knew those bells were ringing for a reason. I just wasn't ready to listen. Because of a misunderstanding, we had a fight, and for a few days, we didn't speak at all. After a few days of tense silence, I finally reached out, hoping to make peace. We started talking again, finding our way back to a more comfortable rhythm. Then, out of nowhere, Nadia mentioned she was planning a trip to Chicago. Chicago? I asked, trying to sound casual. Why? She brushed a strand of hair behind her ear and said, I found a really good running trainer there. Thought it'd be worth the trip to work with him for a few days. She'd recently gotten into running, and I knew she'd been serious about improving. Still, something about the whole thing felt off. Where will you stay? I asked, already feeling a knot tighten in my stomach. She looked at me, hesitated just long enough for the answer to sting, then said, You know where? Tom's apartment? The words came out sharper than I'd intended. Yes, she replied, her tone matter of fact, as if this were the only logical choice. I stared at her, trying to wrap my head around it. Are you serious? I asked, disbelief spilling into my voice. She gave a small sigh, barely meeting my gaze. Yes, sorry. You're just not lucky because you've come across a woman who's been battered by life. She packed her bags that night, barely looking back as she headed out the door. I watched her go, feeling the weight of it settle in, the painful, undeniable truth that she was leaving to be with him. Tom, the same man she'd once left for me. Even as the door closed behind her, a part of me couldn't let go. I still loved her, as twisted and complicated as it was. Every memory we'd shared, every quiet moment and whispered promise, ran through my mind like a film on repeat, reminding me of what we'd had, what I believed was real. I wanted to hate her for leaving, to turn away and forget, but I couldn't. Instead, I was stuck, caught somewhere between the betrayal and the love that still clung to my heart like a weight I couldn't shake. Days went by, and each one without her felt like a slow ache. I'd look at the empty spaces she'd left behind, feeling the loss settle in deeper. And still, I couldn't stop myself from hoping she'd come back. I knew it was foolish, that I was holding on to something already gone. But love, in all its raw, stubborn persistence, doesn't let go that easily. After weeks of waiting, of holding on to the last shred of hope that she might come back to me, I finally made the decision to file for divorce. It wasn't easy. It felt like tearing apart the life we'd built, piece by piece. But I couldn't keep living in the shadow of her choice. Couldn't keep pretending everything was fine when she'd left to be with him. As much as it hurt, I knew I needed to move on, to let go. Then, just when I'd started to make peace with it, she showed up on my doorstep. Her eyes were heavy, her face etched with something I hadn't seen before, regret, maybe even sorrow. She told me she was done with Tom, that going back had made her realize everything she wanted, everything she loved, was right here with me. It was like hearing the words I'd been hoping for, but never thought I'd actually get. Against all the pain and anger that had built up, I let her back in. She was the woman I loved, after all. The one I'd fought for, waited for, and, somehow, couldn't let go of completely. We both knew our marriage was on fragile ground, but I wanted to believe in a fresh start, to trust that things could be different. So, we picked up the pieces and tried again, choosing to stay together despite everything that had happened. It wasn't easy. Those memories, the doubts, the scars she'd left, they didn't just vanish. But with each day, We found ways to move forward, to rebuild something from the wreckage. And for a time, it felt like maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to what we once had. After she came back, things were never quite the same. We tried to make it work. But everything had shifted. There was this underlying tension between us, this quiet distance that never seemed to go away, no matter how many times we promised each other a fresh start. The trust we once had was gone, replaced by this lingering unease, a feeling that something had broken and couldn't be put back together. I'd catch myself wondering about those days she'd spent in Chicago, feeling the bitter truth sink in each time she had cheated on me with him. She'd gone back to Tom, and now, every moment with her felt haunted by that betrayal. It didn't take long for the tension to boil over. One night, we found ourselves arguing again, all the old wounds reopening, every grievance spilling out. I finally confronted her, voicing the fears and doubts I'd been holding back since she came back. She didn't deny it, didn't try to explain or apologize. Instead, she looked at me with this defeated look, like she'd already made her choice. The next morning, she packed her things, and this time, she left for Chicago without a word. There was no apology, no promise to come back, just a silence that told me everything I needed to know. As I watched her go, I knew it was over. This time, I wasn't going to chase her, wasn't going to hold on to a love that had already slipped away. I filed for divorce, knowing it was the only way forward, the only way to finally let go of the woman I'd loved but could never truly hold on to. Months passed, and despite everything, I couldn't get Nadia out of my mind. I kept telling myself I was moving on, that the divorce was the right thing, but every empty night and quiet morning reminded me of the gap she'd left. Then one evening, my phone rang, and there she was, Nadia, her voice soft, familiar, and somehow still able to stir up every feeling I tried to bury. We started talking again, slowly rekindling what we had, as if the months apart had only made the pull between us stronger. Against my better judgment, we decided to give it one more try. It felt like a fragile, reckless hope, but she was the woman I loved, and I couldn't shake that, no matter how much pain had come with it. Things were good for a while, almost like we found a second chance. We were rebuilding, finding pieces of the connection we'd lost, and I started to believe maybe this time we'd make it work. Then, one night, everything changed. She sat me down, her face pale, her hands trembling as she spoke. "I'm pregnant," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. For a second, I felt a surge of something close to joy, imagining that we'd be building a family, that maybe this was our new beginning. But then, she looked away, unable to meet my eyes, and said the words that shattered everything. "The father, it's Tom." Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe. New cheating wife stories tomorrow.